Without further ado, let's get to the point at hand, and that is our speaker. The man, the myth, the legend, the original thunder from down under. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Mr. Troy Lee.
Thank you. So a little bit about myself. Well, first, thank you for coming to my talk. I am from Australia. I have been doing IT since DOS and Windows 3.1 and have worked in a variety of support roles, doing desktop support through to enterprise architecture, and have sort of made the leap to become a bit of a Nagios developer. I've been using XI since 2009, and I really like it because it takes away all those Unix things I don't know, or Linux things. You know, just download the virtual appliance, turn it on, and start clicking buttons. You're already in a monitoring solution. And it's funny because being a Windows guy, I've now switched over, and Mint Linux is my desktop OS of choice at home. I do all my work, and yeah, it's interesting. So, to move on, JavaScript and jQuery. JavaScript in particular is very annoying. The point of this presentation is to try and highlight all these nuances that occur that make things very frustrating. And I wanted to, so this is like a little story we're going to go through of code examples building up to a list and selection and automatic updating on the screen. So without further ado, what is JavaScript? Basically, I was talking to a friend some time ago when I started modifying Nagios XI components and plugins and wizards and things like that. And I wanted to know, how do I change what the user sees on the screen by what they click? And he told me, you're going to have to do it with JavaScript. And I sort of didn't embrace that too easily, based on my past experiences. So that's basically what JavaScript is. It's a client-side application. It allows you to change what's on the screen that the user is seeing, and you don't have to reload the entire page for certain things like this. It allows you to, no, I'll just keep going. I won't go too far in. It's also frustrating. I think we've all been here. If you've played with JavaScript or jQuery, and it's one little spelling mistake and the whole thing stops working. So what is jQuery? Well, that same person I was speaking to about how do I make things work on the screen, he told me that jQuery is what JavaScript should have been. It's simply a list of functions, a library of functions to make your life simpler. And we'll see examples of the code as we go through about why it's simpler and why it makes life much easier to use. So it doesn't replace JavaScript. Everything still is JavaScript. It's just functions that you use. Okay, so we'll do some basic examples and we'll just keep expanding on from there. And what I'm actually going to do initially is to start off with just plain HTML web pages with some JavaScript, and then we'll move further on to to extend it some more, and it gets more complicated. So we'll start off with simple. You guys might know these things, but I wanted to start simple for anyone who doesn't know. In particular, with your coding notes, when you create the files for your HTML and your JavaScript, it always makes sense to have them in this type of format. Otherwise, you can have issues later, and we don't want that. So what I have here, this is a HTML page. It's very simple. What is going to happen is it'll produce this web page with a Click Me button. When you click Me, it pops up and says hello. It's as simple as that. All of the JavaScript is in these script tags here. The input button is here. It has a value, Click Me, and all it does is it calls a JavaScript function called say hello. And the function just brings up an alert box that says hello. Simple as that. And I've got a few of these I'll have to bring up. I keep forgetting I've done it like this, so I can make it easier for you to see. So here it is again, the same one again, but this time I'm going to send through "G'day mate." So what we're doing is, when we call that function say hello, we're actually sending the value through called "G'day mate." So when it alerts, when the function starts, it actually calls whatever it receives input. And that can be anything you want it to be. I've just called it input for ease of use. And then we alert input, which gives you the "G'day mate." The point of this is that we only have one function and we can use it over and over and over and over again. We just send it the message and up pops, "Hello, g'day mate." With the previous example, what would happen is you would have to code multiple functions for each different thing you wanted to say, which is not a great coding practice to do. So that was basically the two differences between those last two examples. We had the say hello, and we actually had hard-coded the word say hello, and in the other one we sent through the value "G'day mate," and we alerting the variable that's received called input. Right, I've got a few of these quick breaks throughout the presentation because it just lets you pause for a sec. Otherwise I ramble on too quickly and we don't make sense. Now what we're going to do is we have a web page that has a select, and when we click the "Click Me" button, it's going to present the value of what you have selected. So now we have this is our select here. This is the select has an ID, and they have two options with values. One option is called value A with the value of it displays value A, and that is the value. And this one is called option 2, and that is the value. What happens now is I'm going to call the function called select value, and I'm going to send through this text string called ID select, which just happens to be the name of my select. So down here below is our function. It grabs that value, ID select, and that's better. And then it defines a variable called var the value. Initially it gets var the element. It goes and gets that element that we just sent it. We send it the name called ID select. It goes and gets that element object from the web page. It then goes and gets what the value is of that element object. So var the element is JavaScript of saying I'm defining a variable, and this is what the variable is. Var the value is we're defining another variable, and we're using the element here, .options.the element.select. Gets quite complicated. In the end, we just alert the value, which is what we're after, and that gives us the value A box. So what about doing that in jQuery? Is it any easier or is it any different? With jQuery, so we've got the same, this is all the same up here. This is the same, we're still sending the name of the ID through. But in the JavaScript, we actually have to call the jQuery library that we need to use so it knows the functions are available. We then, the function here to select the value, that's the name, this ID select. And in this case, all we have to do is one line to get the value. This is the variable we're defining. The way you reference ID objects with jQuery is with a hash. So this is just a concatenated string of a hash plus the variable we've received. So it'll be hash ID select .val. So in the next screen, here's the difference between the two. We had a common HTML where we had the button and it sent the value through. In the JavaScript, we had to use 2 lines to actually get the value. In jQuery, it's just this one line. And this becomes very easy to read the code. You can see the easiness in the fact that up here we have to get the element.options and in brackets the element.selected.index, value, so forth. It gets very complicated and not easy to read. So the point of this is where I was saying earlier, jQuery is what JavaScript should have been. It's just easy to read and it makes things simpler. So we're building on this little story I was talking about, getting things, building on what we have. So now you'll see people online say, you should put all your JavaScript in a separate file. So there's nothing wrong with doing that, and that holds true, and there's many reasons why you would do it. The way you do it is quite simple. This is our HTML file. We're going to go back to the original, one of our original examples. But this time we reference the name of the JavaScript file that we have. And inside the JavaScript file is the exact same code that you had in the HTML page. It's just a way of breaking it out, and it makes it easier to code. And when you start building big files, big JavaScript functions, it's easy to have them in separate files. It makes it easy to manage. So it's a simple, it does the same thing. Another break. Now we're going to introduce PHP. So PHP is it's a recursive backronym. It was used to be called personal homepage, but it became a little bit more than that. So they decided to give it another name. What PHP is, it builds code on the fly. So when you go to a website, instead of a website that's been typed out and someone's coded every little bit of option there, and there's a table and they've typed in the name of the tables and all that sort of stuff, there might be a back-end database that PHP is pulling this data from and automatically creating this table, so that when more information is added to the database, the table will automatically grow the next time you go to that website. So it means it's a way of creating fancy web pages without having to automate it and have functions and all those sorts of things. It's programming for HTML. It does a lot more than that, but we'll stick with that. And everything with a PHP file, everything between these tags is the actual PHP code. So we're going to go all the way back to the start where we had our say hello example. The only difference here is this is the start of the PHP code, this is the end of the PHP code, and we're defining a variable called output. And everything between this little quote, single quote, and this single quote is all HTML, just like it was exactly before. Nothing has changed here, except for we've had to escape these little quotes with the backslash, the backslash. So that means that it sends those, sends them through it interprets it as ignore the next character, so it doesn't get treated as PHP code. And the result, and I'll explain this more as we go, why we have to do this. So we have quotes. PHP have variables that you put all your values in. Oh, sorry, I'll just go back. At the end of this, it actually prints that variable out to the screen. So that's how it generates the code, and then it prints that output. So everything that we quoted before, like test, so in this example here, we have everything in between here is the value of our variable we're defining. Or it could be double quotes as well. Single or double, it's up to you. But there's reasons why you use one over the other. So before, when I escape the quotes, the reason why is PHP thinks the variable is finished and does not expect the next character that it sees. So normally here you have a single quote and then you would finish with a single quote. So it knows the next character is going to be the semicolon which ends the line. But in this example, if it hit this here and there wasn't a semicolon next, it would chuck a wobbly. So, and it doesn't work. So there's some Australianism for you. Or maybe it's just me. Regardless if it's single or double quotes, this variable is defined with double quotes. So when I have these double quotes, because I wanted to actually show "G'day mate" in the line, I have to escape those out. Now, this is the same example before, but with PHP. And what we're doing here is we have to escape these single quotes. And that's because that's how you have to pass a value to JavaScript, is within quotes. So we have to escape them, so when it sends it, it's all good. And that's the JavaScript file, the external JavaScript file stays the same. So in this example, we will still get I haven't got a screenshot here. This will still be the select, it'll pop up the value of the select that you have selected. In the separate JavaScript file, no escaping is required. So this is a really good reason why we put the JavaScript in a separate file, because you actually see here there's a single quote there and a single quote there, and if that was in the PHP file, then we would have to escape those as well, and it starts to get complicated. Now, why double quotes, why single quotes? This gets down to programming basics. With double quotes, anything in between the double quotes can contain a variable that will get expanded. And the way to explain that is I have a variable called food item, and the value is pizza. I have another variable called output, and I'm saying my favourite food is food item. So when it generates it, it actually expands what food item was and now becomes pizza. Pretty straightforward stuff. Single quotes, everything is treated literally like it's plain text. So the exact same item, if I put output, my favourite food is $food item, it will become my favourite food is $food item because of the single quotes. The double, so food item was not expanded and it was treated as plain text. So then, why wouldn't I use double quotes when creating my HTML code? Then I wouldn't need to escape my single quotes that I have. And, you know, that would make things simpler, wouldn't it? Let's have a look. Yes, that's correct. But I actually have to then escape 8 double quotes. And my actual arrows have moved across the place. But here's a double quote, here's a double quote, here's a double quote. Here. I would have to escape all of those just so I didn't need to do the single escaping here. So that's why, and this is where I'm saying if I had used double quotes here and here, when it gets along up to here, I would think that's the end of the variable, but it's not. So now you can see why I didn't do it that way. Now, it's not right or wrong. Both of those ways work. It's just different. And there's reasons why we would use one over the other. Right. So now we've gotten past that little nuance. So that's one of the nuances that you really have to learn right up front, is that escaping of characters, so that when you do copy and paste code in from the internet, that you have to keep that in mind, because you might have code that doesn't take that into account, or you might have something that, like JavaScript, that's in an external file, and if you try to put it in the PHP file, it's not going to work. So you have to escape it. That's why having an external JavaScript file makes things easier. So now we're going to go a little bit more. We're going to do what we call some hiding and showing. And I'm going to introduce divs. And divs are just containers on a web page. It's as simple as that. And in this case, I have 2 divs. One of them's called, I've decided to call it 1, and the other one's called 2. And one of them's going to show a picture of a strawberry, and the other one's going to show a picture of grapes. They both have the same class. Classes are a way of grouping objects together or referencing common objects in HTML with CSS coding. IDs are unique. They need to be the same. They need to be different so that you can reference objects differently. So when I first, and here is the JavaScript of what's happening, and I'll explain what happens. But first, when it loads, nothing is shown. When I click the Click Me button when strawberry is selected, it shows the strawberry. When I click the Click Me for the grape, it shows the grape. What is happening here is the JavaScript function, which we sent on the previous page, we sent the name of the select through. Simple as that. So that's the JavaScript function, and it receives that name. It then goes and gets the value of what that select was. And in my case, my 2 values were ID1 and ID2. And then what it does, it actually hides all class objects. When you put a dot here, a dot hides all class objects called foods. This hash references ID objects, dots reference class objects. So on the first page load, if I go back, these divs are actually hidden to start off with. Both of them are hidden. So on the first time the page loads, nothing's shown, but they're actually sitting there drawn, and it's downloaded those 2 image files already. when you click the button, the first thing I do is hide them all. Well, the first thing I do is get the value. Then I hide them all. Then I show the one that I selected. I show that div object. So the strawberry shows. So when I click, after I do the strawberry and I show the strawberry, if I click the button again after selecting grape, it hides the strawberry and also hides the grape, but the grape was already hidden. And then the next step it does is to show just the grape. Straightforward stuff. Right, so another quick break. Just breaking things up so I'm not flying through and confusing everyone. But I will confuse you, don't worry. So AJAX, this is now we're going to get into AJAX. And what AJAX is before, in the example before, when you loaded the page, both the grape and the strawberry image was loaded at that point in time. So that both that amount of data was downloaded. With AJAX, it allows you to load content into a div, or there's lots of things you can do, but in my examples, we're going to load content into the div. So it's not until we actually need it that we're going to download it. And so AJAX is a group of technologies used to implement web applications. It sends a request back to the server and then retrieves the data. The server processes it and then sends the results back, and then you display it on the screen. It does not interfere with the current state of the page, so it's not a full page reload, it might just be a section. And that's why you see these spinning logos on different sites you go to and that sort of stuff. So we're going to now step it up a bit, and instead of when I load the page, we're not going to have anything, we're not going to download, we're not going to have the strawberry, all the grape displayed and downloaded initially. We're just going to use one div called ID content. And these are little comment tags. So I'm just putting here so I know I'll populate this later. And what happens is the page is displayed, it draws a select, it puts the button there that we're going to press, it creates this blank div with nothing in it. It has the JavaScript, the jQuery reference for the library, and it has the external JavaScript code. Then and what I forgot to mention was, now that we're doing AJAX, we're actually adding another file. We're adding a file that we're going to reference to call to process and then send the information back from that file. So the JavaScript itself, when it receives the function is called, it gets the value of the select that we have. And then also we define a variable of that div object that we're going to load, which is currently empty. Now this is the AJAX string. And I bring it back. What it does is that's the name of the div. This is the $sign. So that references the div object. This is a jQuery specific. The .load, and in these brackets, it's referencing that content.php file, and it's sending through an item or an object called selection with the value of the item that we selected. So when this information gets sent back to our server receives it, it gets the value of this object we sent it, and we're just doing some if-else statements. So if this equaled 1, the output will be the strawberry image. And if it's 2, the output's going to be the grape image. And then it prints it. So what will happen? So .load is a jQuery function that performs the AJAX request. The server is told to load the page. This is everything I just said. So, and the important thing is .load replaces the div contents in this in this example. So what I'm not showing you here is the same thing would have happened previously with the other example. When you click the button, it would show you the grape. When you click the button, it would show you the strawberry and so forth. But only the strawberry image would be downloaded when you downloaded the when you click the button. They're not sitting there loaded, ready to go. So, conclusion on my examples. We've done some simple HTML and jQuery and JavaScript and AJAX and PHP. Now this is where I'm going to actually show you how this becomes useful, and this is probably the reason why you're here. But I wanted to go through all those little things, because all those little things make a big impact. And this guy never used jQuery because he's still got hair. Okay, so it's time to do some XI. This is actually an IBM data processing system. Nagios XI. So what I have is a component demo that I've created, and these will be made available with the slides online after the conference is finished and they're all put online. So you'll be able to go in and have a look at the code, because I can't put all of the code on here. It's very hard to do that. But you will see sections of the code, and then you'll be able to play with it later. So my goal here is I want to show a list of hosts, then I want to select a host, and then show a list of all the services for that host. So to start off with, we have a PHP file called component demo. We have a variable where this case and this break is part of a big PHP switch function. It's like a big if else, that sort of thing. But switches I like them, they're fun. So we define a variable called output. Hey there. We define an empty div called hosts, and we have an empty div called services. Let's see if I have, no. And as the page loads, it actually then calls a JavaScript function called populate hosts, and then bang, 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 that's the end of it. That's all we're doing. The JavaScript file has two functions. Right now we're just going to play with this function where it's going to load the hosts. So this does the .load that we were talking about before, sending a JavaScript request. And in this case, I'm not sending any values except for the name of my request. My name of my request is called hosts. But I'm not sending any, we haven't gotten anything off the page at this point. It's bad programming. I've hard-coded something in, so I can only use this for this purpose. But I didn't want to complicate things either, too, with these examples. This is the PHP file that we've just loaded. What we've done, and this is a switch statement inside the PHP file, and this is the host, this was the request that we got through. So XI has some background functions available for you to get objects and get items in there, and so you can do this sort of stuff with it. What that is we call the function called get XML host objects with this variable called args, which is this here, which is an array of items. And in this case, we only want active hosts, and we want to order them by the name of the host in an ascending order. We then go and we create a variable that goes and that calls that function. So now we have a variable with all of these hosts. So then what I do is, now it's not an array, it's an XML object. So then what I do is I pass through the XML object and create this select list with all these different hosts. And I won't try and explain it here because the code gets more complicated and not helpful, but the name of the select starts here. These dot equals here are appending to this output. This variable started up here somewhere, and now we're adding to it, because if we just put equals, it overwrites it. So the dot equal appends to it. So we're creating the select, but that's not the end of a select. The select has got options and values. So there's the option we're putting, each line we're putting in here dynamically. So this is what I was talking about before about PHP being able to do things dynamically. If we're just doing a for each host item that's in this XML host objects, we're then looping through them and getting the name of them and putting them in this lovely select list. And then we end our select, and then we add the button at the end. And the button itself calls the populate services function that I showed you earlier. So back here, I've got my local host that I've selected. I'm going to click Get Host Services, and it will call this populate services function in JavaScript. And what it will do is, we know I'm defining the variable, the div I want to load, which is this empty div called ID services. And then we also want the actual host we selected. So it goes and gets the value of this item we've selected. It then does the JavaScript load function, calling this component demo misc file, sending through the request name that I want is services, and The name of the host is host selected. Now, did I pop this up big? I didn't. What I'm doing here is I am encoding the host name as well at the same time so that any fancy characters get turned into normal text so it doesn't break stuff as it sends it through. Then here we are. This is part one of 2 slides that's going to build the list of services. And I'll explain this in a second. We get the host name passed to us. So what we're actually doing here is we would need the name of the host to start off with. So we actually decode. Well, let's work backwards. We request a variable called host name, but it's encoded, so then we decode it at the same time. This could be 2 lines, but you can make it 1 line. What I'm talking about over here is don't use get. So back in one of my really early examples, we had the, let me think about this for a second. We use this is the standard way you get and post objects in HTML. But in XI, it's got this function called grab request var, which sanitizes data and checks the security and makes sure that you don't do nasty things. So what happens here is, once again, we're going to use this XML function to get the service status, but we need to pass the arguments. So the arguments we're sending are, the command is to get the service status. They have to have been checked. They have to be for the object for the host name that we actually selected. They have to be active, and this is how much information will be returned back. So that creates that value. Then we loop through to start off with. If it's more than 0, so if we actually got items back, we're then going to create the table of services to display, which is on this page. And we loop through the XML object, and I define a couple of variables like the service name, the current state, the status text, and then we create the row in the table. In the previous page, I created the table, I created the header. Now I'm creating the row in the table, and in the table, this is if I didn't have any results turned, I will just output a message saying, hey, it doesn't have any services. So what does it look like? That's what it would look like. So what the example here was, you can see how to access the backend API to get objects and services, and you can see how I've used divs to load it. And there wasn't a full page reload done to actually make all this happen. Now I'm running out of time, but I have a couple of last things we're going to go through. So we'll skip right past the break. We're going to make it pretty with little ASCII. No. So what I'm going to do now is add that spinning logo. Now with AJAX, it's asynchronous, which adds complications, because while one thing's doing something, it will go and do something else, and it makes things great. But for what I want to do, it makes it a bit weird and hard. So you'll see some code that's different. It's very much the same again, except this time, let me think, I've added 2 extra divs. I've added a div called a host throbber and a services throbber, and I'm called the throbber being the spinning logo. And XI has a built-in function called getThrobber HTML, which will display the image for you. So you don't even need to go and create an image or anything. It's there ready to go. So when the page loads, it's not displayed. This host ID is empty. It calls the script, the JavaScript, to populate this host list. So we'll actually look at what happens then. This is the AJAX call. I have a function called component AJAX setup, which defines some values. I'm turning off the asynchronous and I'm turning off cache. But what's happening down here, this doesn't get used straight away. The first thing, this is the function that gets called in the JavaScript. We define the div we're going to load. We define the name of the throbber. So we hide that div we're going to load. We show the throbber. So right now the logo is spinning. It's spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. Then we call this this function here to define the AJAX variables before we do our load. We then do our load, which was before we send that request through. This is the file we're going to load, and that was the request. But what's different here is we've added a comma, and then we've added a function. So what happens is when this is finished, then perform this function, and the function is hide the throbber and show the div that we want to show, and then that's the end of the load. So rather than me try and show you a live demo, I like screenshots that show you what the live demo would look like. So while the host lists are being retrieved, you get the spinning logo, and then when it's been retrieved, it disappears and the list and the button appears instead of its place. So all I've done is got two divs, and spinning logo is shown, this one's hiding, and then this one gets hidden and this one's shown. It's as simple as that. So now you know why I went through that simple example of showing and hiding divs, because it makes sense here. Then when you click the button to say, I want to get all the services for the host, it's very much the same thing. This is this common function I had before, and in this case, I've got the function to populate the services. I've got the div we're going to load, the host we need to know the value of. We've got the name of the throbber div for the services. So we hide the div that's going to show all the information. We show the throbber. We call this common function. But now this time the AJAX query is different again, or the AJAX request. And what's happening is, before I'd have a question mark and all the values I'm sending through, but this time I have a comma and I open up an array object and send them through in this function where the request is services and the host name is the host selected, and I've encoded it. And it's this encode bit which meant that I had to do it this way instead of the other way. If I did it the other way, it would just stop working altogether. Then there's that comma. So after that works and completes, then it hides the throbber and shows the content and ends it. So what would that look like? Okay, so there's our host. We click the button, the logo is spinning, it's off doing stuff, and then when it finishes, there's our list of services. And I've displayed here the state, so these are all okay, the name and their status. Simple as that. I've got one or two little things to go through. So very quickly, I said before you should put JavaScript in external files, but there are times when that doesn't actually make sense. An example you go and have a look later on is this status info dashlet I created. And it's a dashlet where you can take the service state of an object and display it big on the screen. And you can actually cut text. You can show, in this one here, I'm not showing the name of the host and the item. It's not there. It's just a way of selecting different items, making them big and small and all that sort of stuff. But the point of this is these all load every 7 minutes or whatever you select. And there's a bunch of these on a dashboard. So they all have a unique ID. And you need to, there's a timer going on your client side saying, well, I need to refresh the objects now. But each one's a different object. So what we actually do is, and this is a code example, because I'm running out of time, I can't go into it much. But what's happening is, rather than having a separate JavaScript file, I know this $ID is my unique value for each dashlet. So I'm actually calling the div object itself a unique number. And then this countdown timer I was talking about, and I want to load that div. Well, I know what that unique div is now, so I'm going to load it on load, and then I've got a set interval function that does a counting. Now somewhere else I've got the interval defined. So every 7 minutes, it's then going to perform that load action again on that div dashlet. So if you were to inspect the element, or inspect that dashboard and all the HTML code, you would see, if you had 10 dashlets, you would see 10 JavaScript functions, define 10 separate JavaScript, but they're all unique because they use this unique ID. So the whole point of that was, was that it just saves coding and it makes it more efficient. So there's no hard and fast rules. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's just different. It makes things easier, it makes things harder. Some very quick troubleshooting steps, because it's annoying, is test frequently. Don't do a short story of coding and then expect it to work. Do 2 lines and test it. Alert is a simple way of that, but g'day mate, or hello there, say hello, pop-up box is a great way of knowing where the code got up to. Because if it processes the code and then it'll stop where it breaks. So you could have the alert box here and it works, and you could move it down 10 lines and it stops working, you know it's your error is between these areas. Another one is console.log is a better method altogether. So very quickly, here's the alert example. where I'm actually alerting the value of something, and I've actually included some quotes around the value so I know there's actually a value there. Because sometimes you try to alert something, you just get an empty window. So if you put quotes and there's nothing in the quotes, you know, well, there's no value you retrieved. But the whole point here is what I explained. You know where it is up to in the code. Console.log works similar way, but when you inspect an element or you open the console of your browser, then you can get in and get more information about what's going on, and that's this line here. I've only recently discovered this, well, people have told me, so I've been doing it the hard way for a long time. Another troubleshooting tip is to comment out lines. So if you did that short story and it's not working, you don't have to delete it. You can just comment out all these lines and they'll be ignored. So in this case, it will just go, I tested and I found, well, it worked up to here, but it didn't work down there. When I comment out all these, it continues to work. But it doesn't break because the code's not actually being interpreted. All right, we're nearly there. So have a look at these if you want to see examples of how this works in actual functional, useful things. I had an EMC Clarion wizard I initially created that goes off and queries all the hosts on all the LUNs on a EMC SAN or all the volumes, populates them in a list, and you can tick the box and set warning and critical values. Save spelling mistakes. The performance data tool I created is another one that does a lot of this. High charts, which is a new XI component for a while now with the pretty graphs, that is all JavaScript or it's all AJAX. The ping action and traceroute action, once again, they're loads. Google Maps, bird's eyes. Right, conclusion. Don't become a baldness statistic. If George Costanza knew what I know now, he'd have a lot more hair on his head. Learn by experimenting, take those baby steps, you know, do little things, and go forth and create some awesome XI add-ons. Any questions? Don't be afraid if there isn't, because, oh, we have one here. It can be a dry topic.
Are there already plugins, like if I wanted to, let's say, write a plugin in Node.js as opposed to doing PHP, is that something that I could do?
That's a good question. I believe some people have played around with that sort of stuff, but I haven't gotten that far myself. Okay. Good question. Bad response.
It's a bit more of a comment. You'll want to check out developer tools on Google Chrome and Firefox.
Okay.
You have full debugging tools. If you've ever used like GDB, you can stop your JavaScript and
Excellent.
set stop points, run it to there. It works way better. That's what all of our developers use.
I'll have a look into that because I waste hours. Excellent. Thank you for that.
Any other questions? Troy was that thorough. Amazing. That's great.
Too easy.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, a nice round of applause for Troy Lee.